Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. As always, it's a pleasure to welcome you, and especially here in this beautiful room, the Notteboomzaal of the Hendrik Conscience Heritage Library. It used to be a chapel, and a very special chapel, a richly decorated chapel by the Jesuits, where the sodalities gathered. You should have come some months before. Then you could see in this very room the virtual reconstruction of the original chapel based on a beautiful painting and realized by our colleagues of the Hendrik Conscience Heritage Library in the framework of our festival Baroque Influencers. But even more important than the physical reconstruction of the wealthy decorated chapel is the bringing to life again of the tradition of the sodalities. These were fraternities where people came together who all share the same faith and who occupy influential positions in society. And they came together not only to broaden their network, but above all to reflect upon and discuss pressing questions. The famous painters Peter Paul Rubens and Antoine van Dyck were active members of the sodality based here in the former chapel. As initiator and coordinator of the City Festival Baroque Influencers, it's significant for UCSIA, the University Center Sint Ignatius Antwerp, that we can start the last part of our lecture series on big questions in this symbolic place. And thank you to our partners of the Heritage Library for hosting us. It's at the same time the last month of our festival. And we've done, and are still doing, so many things. We've organized no less than 3 exhibitions. You can still visit the current exhibition in the Havenhuis on the role of contemporary art in society. We've offered music concerts. We've made various city walks, we've produced podcasts, we've set up various debates and lectures, and so on. With our city festival, we wanted to bring people together and let them reflect upon the big questions and challenges of our time, while finding inspiration in the very similar 17th century. And if we could wish for only one lasting heritage of Baroque influencers, it's exactly the revival of the sodality, the coming together to discuss in an open atmosphere with people from different backgrounds the major challenges we face today. During our lecture series, Big Questions, we've discussed important topics, such as the tension between solidarity and responsibility, the connection between religion, identity, and inclusion, and the importance of mathematics and sciences in our education systems and for society. And the last theme we wanted to put on the agenda within the framework of our festival is that of the mission. For indeed, the 17th century was a pivotal time for the development and spreading of the countless religious missions. And the Jesuits as well played a major role in the setup of these missions, both to the east and the west. There was no other religious order whose network was as broad and well organized as that of the Jesuits. It goes without saying that these missions have done a lot of harm. It's something we need to further explore and recognize. But next to that, it's worth investigating to what extent the encounters between very different cultures and peoples have given rise to something new, valuable in itself, a lasting witness of a fruitful exchange. In that sense, we are very lucky that the Jesuits documented their experiences very well. And one of these documents are their maps. During this evening, we will return to the 17th century, the maps and the encounters in the West. 2 weeks later, we will go to the other side of the world and have a look at the encounters which Ferdinand Verbist had in the East with the Chinese. And finally, we will ask ourselves whether the mission can still have a future today, and if so, what kind of future? I'm very grateful and honored that for this evening, two eminent scholars have accepted our invitation to share their knowledge about 17th century Jesuit cartography with us. So a warm welcome to you, Mirela Altic and Alex Lopes de Carvalho. I will say no more, but give the floor to Christiane Stallaert, who is a professor of Spanish and Latin American Studies at the University of Antwerp. She will introduce the team and the speakers to you and will moderate a conversation with Dr. Altic and Dr. Carvalho. Many thanks to you as well, Christiane. I'm very excited to hear what you and our guests have to say about missions, maps and mediators, influential encounters between Jesuits and Native Americans. I wish you all a very enriching evening full of surprises.
Thank you, Erik, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. In this short introduction, I would like to briefly outline the historical context. Very soon after its foundation around 1540, the Society of Jesus established missions in Asia, Africa, and America, becoming one of the first global enterprises. Jesuits were not only present in all continents, but also interconnected thanks to the systematic exchange of information in the form of letters and reports written by the missionary priests. The circulation of first-hand knowledge on a global scale allowed Jesuits to develop, to a certain extent, a non-Eurocentric approach to other cultures, and even to question European certainties. Let me give an example. In 1585, the Portuguese Jesuit Luís Frois, who spent more than 30 years in Japan, wrote a treatise on the contradictions and differences in customs between Europeans and the inhabitants of the province of Japan. In the section, How Japanese Drink and Eat, he states, "We eat everything with our fingers. Japanese men and women from childhood used to chopsticks." And further, mentioning another distinction as a logical consequence of the former, "We wash our hands before and after meals. The Japanese, who do not take food with their fingers, have no need to wash them." Although the account stresses the differences between both cultures, it is non-judgmental. On the contrary, the Portuguese Jesuit remarks that despite the many contradictions with European norms, the Japanese are civilized, vivid-minded people full of natural wisdom. Almost simultaneously, Spanish Jesuit José de Acosta was exploring the American New World. It is amazing to see how knowledge and information from other continents was integrated in Acosta's interpretation of Amerindian cultures. In his work, Acosta refers explicitly to Japanese or Chinese customs, I quote, "as learned from the letters of the priests of our company in Japan." European moral or even theological concepts, such as sin, the devil, or the Holy Sacrament of Christian communion, are put in a cross-cultural perspective against the background of Japanese, Chinese, Peruvian, or Mexican practices. Acosta looks for analogies between cultures, trying to create an understanding of an intrinsically plural world. Diversity is one of the key concepts of Acosta's work. This awareness of global diversity, informed by an ever-expanding empirical knowledge, leads to a sort of cultural relativism. Seen from Acosta's point of view, it is not always the foreign other who is perceived as doing things the opposite way or upside down, but Europe as well. The so-called New World is not new, he writes. Empirical evidence leads him to criticize European misconceptions of the world. He becomes aware of the shortcomings of Eurocentric knowledge, even of what had been accepted as physical or natural laws. However, even if a worldwide, on-the-ground experience in different social and natural settings made Jesuits aware of the limits of European knowledge, they were not free thinkers. The Company of Jesus had been created for the defense of the Roman Catholic Church. It was the spiritual army of the Counter-Reformation, and the Low Countries were the very epicenter of the conflict. In 1585, when the Portuguese Frois wrote his treatise on Japan, the city of Antwerp was recaptured by the Spanish troops. As a consequence, thousands of Flemish Protestants fled to the Northern Republic. One of them was a Flemish cartographer, Petrus Plancius, who emigrated from Brussels to Amsterdam, taking with him secret information of Spanish colonial cartography. This information was crucial for the rapid maritime expansion of the young republic. The religious and political confrontation on the European continent had its counterpart in the Americas, with the Spanish Empire fighting the English, the Dutch, and the French, or even opposing the Portuguese in conflicts over colonial borders. Maps were of utmost importance to defend or claim territories. And the Jesuit order, from its very foundation, had made cartography one of the pillars of its educational project. In the first lecture of this evening, Mirela Altic will tell us more about the role of Jesuit cartography in the Americas, which is also the subject of her beautifully illustrated book, Encounters in the New World, published with University of Chicago Press in 2022. Mirela Altic is Chief Research Fellow at the Institute of Social Sciences and full professor at the Department of History at the University of Zagreb. She's an expert in social history of maps, cross-cultural knowledge exchange, and early modern encounters. Her analysis shows that more than just a physical survey of unknown space, Jesuit mapping was in fact the most important link to enable exchange of ideas and cultural concepts between the old world and the new. Secondly, Francismar Alex Lopes de Carvalho will focus on the Jesuit missions of Spanish Amazonia and the link between religion and power. Dr. Carvalho is a research fellow of the Alexander von Humboldt Stiftung at the University of Bonn and professor at the Department of History at the State University of Rio de Janeiro. In his lecture, he will highlight both the endurance and transformations of indigenous customs and beliefs as a result of the intercultural and interreligious dialogue between Jesuit missionaries and Amazonian natives. Among his contributions to the field are two recent books, Missionizing on the Edge and Natives, Iberians, and Imperial Loyalties in the South American Borderlands, both published in 2022. Mirela, you have the floor.
So thank you very much, Christiane, for that very nice introduction. So before I start, I want to express my gratitude to organizer of this beautiful event, to University of Antwerp, and to Barbara, Christiane, and Gilke, and Chris in particular. Thank you for your invitation. It's a great pleasure for me to be with you tonight. In my presentation today, I will talk about the Jesuit map-making in the French, Portuguese, and the Spanish Empire in the both Americas. In particular, I would like to show you several important things. How these cartographies were influenced by imperial politics, so from the above, but also from the local historical context from below. how indigenous knowledge was incorporated into the Jesuit science, which is a very important part of the story, because you will see that Jesuit map making is not a typical colonial map making. It's a result of the cross-cultural exchange with native communities. And in the end, how Jesuits influenced the Western perception of the Americas and their indigenous communities. And I'm opening my presentation today with this particular world map. Okay, I will open this presentation with this particular world map, which is, of course, compiled by one Jesuit, Heinrich Scherer, very famous, a Jesuit scholar. This map is compiled in 1703 in Germany, and it shows a spatial distribution of the Jesuit missions across the world. But you can see it's a very unusual world map because it is computed in the polar, in the circular projection with one specific aim, to highlight the Jesuits' globality, their connectivity, how they are connected and present in every corner of the world. There is another interesting thing about that map. It is accompanied by a very strong Catholic iconography with very strong images that shows, again, it makes a very strong statement about the Jesuits. Here on the left, you can see, of course, Ignacio Loyola as a founder of the Society of Jesus. On the right, you can see St. Francis Xavier, the co-founder of the society, but also a missionary in charge for the Asia. Here you can see Jose Anchieta, a missionary in charge for Brazil and South America. And here on the right, you can see André Oviedo, a missionary. He was in charge for Ethiopia and in general for Africa. So the whole map makes a very strong statement about the presence of the Society of Jesus in every corner of the world. All that in 1703. So when we talk about the Society of Jesus in early modern era, we have to consider the global situation that was present at the moment. So what is important to understand the Jesuits in that particular moment? We all know they're established in 5040. That's something we all learned in the school. Of course, it is the time of Counter-Reformation. But somehow we used to forget about the fact that this is the time of the exploration and European expansion as well. And that fact made Jesuits a major stakeholder in the history of exploration and mapping as well. So they've been in the right place in the right moment. Which is also very important to say about the Jesuits, their strong commitment to missionization made them to establish the first global network. So Society of Jesus is considered as the first global corporation in the world. And how global they were, it's very well presented with this emblematic illustration, which is, by the way, published in Antwerp in 1640. So you can see the angel holding the two hemispheres in his hand, and with motto, one world is not enough. So it's a story about the spreading. So that's, again, a very strong message. Jesuits were extremely well with messages. Of course, we have to say that Jesuits were not the first monastic order in the New World. They've been preceded by other orders like Recollects, like Dominicans, Benedictines, of course, Franciscans, and they were all involved in exploration and sometimes in mapping, but no one been so powerful and successful as the Jesuits because their strong connection with the king and the church. So very soon they became absolutely predominant when it comes to exploration. And they've been very successful. Only 2 years after the establishment of the Society of Jesus, they already established first mission in Goa, and they continued the missionization of the Eastern Asia. After that, they start to spread the mission in Africa very successfully. And only then they start to missionize America. So America or Americas were actually the last on their list. So the first missions in America appeared in the Portuguese Empire in Brazil in 1549. Only then the Spanish Empire started to establish first mission in Florida, and they continue with Peru and so on further south. And then, as a third step, the French Empire started to establish Jesuit missions in New France, in modern day Canada, mostly. So you can see it is a long list, but America was on the bottom of that list. But America, surprisingly, proved to be their greatest success, not only in the terms of missionization, but also in the term of exploration and mapping. So why Jesuits became so successful as cartographers, as map makers? Because, as I said, there is other authors who preceded them, and they've been also involved in exploration and mapping. So why Jesuits became so successful and influential in the field of map making? There is several factors. First of them, of course, is their centralized structure. So you know that Ignatius Loyola was a military person because before he became a missionary. So they have a very strict order, horizontal and vertical. They have audiencias, they have provinces with urban cities as educational centers, and they have missions as a provincial outpost, also with missions and missionary schools. They have obligation to regular reports to their superior, and that contributed to their cooperative culture of sharing. So they used to collaborate and share information as part of their standard procedure. It's very important. That makes them very effective, because one Jesuit would start some exploration and some other Jesuit, thanks to sharing, would successfully continue the exploration. Of course, they were not just capable in gaining the knowledge, they are extremely efficient in dissemination of their findings, of their knowledge. So they have their own publishing services across Europe, which disseminate everything they find out about the New World. And one of the first series is Litera Annua. It's annual reports that first of the volumes were actually published here in Antwerp. It is also very typical and very important to mention about the Jesuit missionaries is their ethnic diversity. Their ethnic diversity made them receptive for other cultures. So the Jesuits were not just speaking Spanish-speaking people or Portuguese-speaking people. They came from across Europe, and many of them came actually from the Central Europe, my country included, and that the ethnic diversity made them very receptive for others. That is one of the very important parts of their success. Of course, they had to teach. Since 1560, all Jesuits had to teach, and they established educational presence at every level, thanks to that rule. So they have universities and colleges in the urban centers. They have a smaller school in the missions. They've been everywhere. Not to mention, they've been also educator of the kings, of the nobilities, and of the Creole elites in South America. So they've been extremely influential. And last but not least, it's their academic excellence. The Jesuits have been the best educated people of their time, not only in the natural sciences, but also in humanities. So their ratio studiorum was very comprehensive. And this small image, I think you can see it, it's an image of the curriculum of the Jesuit College in Barcelona, which shows the fields of their teaching. So you can see they've been educated in religion, in theology, in politics, in heraldry, in geography and astronomy, in cosmography, in martial art, even in linguistics and in art, especially in music. So they've been very well educated. And we know for the fact, especially in the 18th century, they've been taught at Jesuit colleges also engineering, geometry, agriculture things, how to draw the maps, how to use the maps, and they've been taught also history of exploration and European expansion. So they've been very well prepared for their mission in the New World. And what is particular place of the Jesuits in map making of America? When the European expansion started, of course, the first map was created by royal authorities or chartered companies, and they created the first map that shows only the outlines of the America. That is one of the examples. This is the map from 50-50 produced by Sebastian Münster in his Cosmographia. So you can see only the outlines of the North and South America, but anything in the interior is empty. It's still need to be done. On the right hand, you can see another map related to Jesuits also. It's map from the mid-18th century. So if you take a look of that map, it's a modern map. It's almost a topographic map, a very serious map. So compare this map with this map. And my crucial question, how we came from this stage to this stage of geographical knowledge? And I argue in my book that one of the crucial links between them is actually regional mapping by Jesuits. Why? Because after the colonial power arrived on the coastal, they mostly stay in the coastal area of Americas. But they sent the Jesuits, they've been sent off into interior to explore interior of Americas, to establish missions and to establish a connection with indigenous communities in the interior. So the Jesuits were the one who made the first exploration, who compiled the first regional maps of the interior, and those maps compiled together enabled to colonial cartography and official state cartography to be developed about mid of the 18th century. So Jesuit cartography and their regional mapping of the interior was the crucial link between that first stage and the developed cartography that we know done by the colonial authorities. What Jesuits had mapped in America, because most of the people thought, because they are missionaries, of course, that was core business, they were dealing mostly with ecclesiastic things. That is somehow true, but it's not the whole true. They mapped almost everything, depending on the needs. So here on the left, you can see one of the map of the Sonoran province from 1692. It's modern-day northern Mexico. The map was produced by Adam Gil. By the way, it's a Jesuit from Slovakia, so as I said, there is a certain diversity, ethnic diversity. So you can see the basic physical geography, the position of the missions, and that is something we would call a typical missionary map. And of course, this map is compiled to a company report on the missionary activities. So business as usual. This is something we would call a typical missionary map. But that's not all. That is just start. On the right, you can see another map. It's Bahia de la Paz. It's part of Baja California, Californian Peninsula. This map is compiled in 1737 by the Croatian Jesuit Ferdinand Konščak. And this map is compiled together with the help of the Royal Spanish Navy. So Jesuit father worked for the Spanish Royal Navy, and there was no any missions here. So this map was compiled for clearly military purpose. So look at the map, look at the configuration of the terrain. It's almost a topographic map. And look at the soundings. They have a depth of the water. Because they wanted, the purpose of the map is they wanted to establish the new presidio, the new fortress in Bahia de la Paz for the purpose of the Spanish military authorities. So the purpose of the map was completely military. So this is a military map compiled by Jesuits. Another two unusual examples which illustrates how diverse the map making of Jesuits was. This is the map which shows a Mexico City with its vicinity. The map was compiled by Enrico Martinez and Juan Sanchez Baquero in 1608, and it shows a hydrographic situation around Mexico City, and the purpose of the map was drainage work. So they've been involved in river training and drainage work to enable better urban development for Mexico City. So you can see they've been involved in all kinds of activities. And on the right, this is one of the Portuguese Jesuit maps that shows Colonia do Sacramento. It's present-day Uruguay. The map appeared just after the Colonia do Sacramento as an important fort was handed over from Spaniards to Portuguese. And a Portuguese Jesuit, Diego Soares, compiled this map in 1731. But look at this map. It's a map of the fortified town. Again, very military map. The Jesuits are not even mentioned on the map. So what I want to point it out, that the Jesuits were involved in all kind of map making. All what is needed, they would do it because they were educated enough to conduct any kind of mapping. Which is also very important to say about the Jesuit missionaries. We always thought about the missionaries only as a religious person. But even they have a personal background that influence their understanding of the space. So these are two maps that appeared as a result of the same expedition. There was a maritime Jesuit expedition along the Atlantic coast of the Patagonia, and the expedition was conducted by José Quiroga and José Cardiel, two Jesuits. And each of them compiled their own map. So this is the first map that appeared. That map was compiled by José Quiroga. Look at this map. It's a nautical chart. So he outlined the coastline, some capes, and things important for navigation. And of course, which is very important, he presented interior of Patagonia as an empty space. There is nothing interesting for him there. In the contrast, his colleague, José Cardiel, he compiled this map. It's a practically anthropological map of Patagonia. So he made difference between indigenous culture, they travel by foot, or they use horses, or they do the agriculture. So for him, Patagonia was full of life and full of culture. But you have to understand that José Quiroga, in his previous life, was experienced mariner. So he was, of course, interested in navigation and the coastal belt. But José Cardiel was a true missionary who spent most of his life in the Paraguayan mission. So he was interested in human geography. So you can see how two missionary people can see the same space with completely different eyes. Which is also important to say that sometimes the maps are influenced by imperial politics, but sometimes by the local needs. This is the example of imperial politics. This is the map of Baja California, the Californian Peninsula, compiled the Croatian Jesuit Ferdinand Korczak in 1746. And it looks like a typical missionary maps. You can see here, he mapped all the missions with the symbol of the church, something we would expect. However, the real purpose of this map was not missionary at all. The real purpose of the map is to show the physical geography of California. So the point is to prove that California is actually peninsula and not the island, because people believed for a very long time that Baja California is actually an island. And this map was made by the order of the Spanish king as a final proof that Baja California is peninsula and not the island. And that very copy of this map was sent to the Spanish king. And after that, Spanish court made as official notice that Baja California is peninsula and not an island. So you can see how one map can change the history. So this is the map that was actually sent to the Spanish king. Of course, Jesuits were deeply engaged in protection and helping of indigenous community they worked with. So this is one of the Spanish Jesuit maps that shows Paraguayan province and very famous Guarani missions. This map appeared in the aftermath of Treaty of Madrid. That treaty in 1750 changed drastically the borders between the Spanish Empire and the Portuguese Empire. And all that, what is marked by yellow, it was a Spanish territory that's supposed to be handed over to the Portuguese side. But that meant that all that missions, Guarani missions, had to be removed. And of course, Jesuits try to find some good solution for their missions. So Jose Cardiel, by this map, tried to advocating the missions and try to advocate a peace. So this green line that you can see here, that was his proposal as a compromise. Please do not take the borderland here, but here, in that way, the Portuguese will still get the large portion of the territory, but Guarani mission would be able to stay on their own place. Unfortunately, we know from the history that didn't happen. So after that, Guarani war broke out. It was a very bloody war, and most of the Guarani missions were destroyed. So that is the example how the maps were used in the diplomacy in attempting to protect the missions. And sometimes, as I said, the maps are a result of the local needs. This is again a part of one Spanish Jesuit map of the northern Mexico. It's Sonora and Sinaloa. Again, we would say another typical missionary map because it shows a basic physical geography. It shows position of the missions, so nothing special. That map appeared in 1722. However, when you make a deep analysis of this map, and that is the reconstruction I made, you can see as further. You can see, of course, the borders of the provinces. You can see the presidios, the military fortifications. You can see, of course, the missions. But you can notice that the most frequent sign is here, this red one. And this red one actually designate the royal mines, the mining places. Why the Jesuits would map a mining places? Because they were not involved in mining business. So why they would be interested at all? The truth is that this is actually the most northern part of the Spanish Empire at that moment. So this is the borderland, and the military officers who were stationed in the borderlands, in the fortress, they left their position to join the lucrative business in the mining seats. So they put the whole borderlands in dangers, including missions, and that's why Jesuits got interested in that. So they made this map with more than 50 mining seats. And they sent that particular map to the military authority in Mexico City, asking the viceroy to do something because the borderland is in danger. And as a result of this particular map, the military inspection was sent to the borderland, and the whole borderland was reformed as a consequence of that map. So that map actually started the course of the events. So you can see again how one Jesuit map changed the course of the history. In the end, with all that I said, it's important to ask, does missionary cartography make a distinctive genre of cartography? Is a Jesuit map making difference than other map makers? Because we saw they produce large number of maps and reports that strongly influence the Western vision of the world, of course, but they've been driven by the practical needs, but they've been also driven by their religious persuasion, but they've been also driven by colonial administration. So they've been agents of both the empire and of the church. So they've been also part of colonial drive. We shouldn't forget that. So in that sense, should we treat Jesuit cartography as a part of colonial cartography because they work for colonial power too? So there is some difference between typical colonial cartography and missionary cartography, because the Jesuit cartography is based on the first-hand knowledge, so on their observation, but they are also a result of the cross-cultural exchange with indigenous communities there. So that's something what is not typical for colonial cartography. So that makes difference between the colonial geography and Jesuit science and Jesuit cartography. As I said, they're based on the first-hand knowledge, so maybe we can put Jesuit cartography as a part of explorative cartography because there is lots of exploration in their map. However, it makes a separate genre because the Jesuit cartography also has something that exploratory cartography doesn't have. Because Jesuit cartography, it's always driven by religious motivation. They're interested in topology, the network of information, not for the single information, but the network of information they're going to present on the map. And of course, they are different by their distinctive iconography. And how much geography was important for Jesuit science, it shows you this particular image, again given by Heinrich Scherer. It's an allegory that shows the hierarchy in the science. You can see each person represent each one field: cartography, geometry, history, arithmetic, astronomy, topography. But look, who is on the top? It's geography, which makes a queen of Jesuit science. Not only that, it's a queen, it's a she. It's very interesting to think about even today that on the top of the science is a female figure, because even today when we talk about the scholarship, women are a large minority. But in Jesuit science, the queen of the sciences was she, a geography. I mentioned iconography of the Jesuit maps. That's something that makes distinction of other maps. So as much as diverse the Jesuit maps are, they're always coherent, but they are very specific iconography, the symbology of the maps. The purpose of the Jesuit maps is always to maintain the positive image of the church and of the empire, and they intend to influence opinion and beliefs. So they're part of so-called persuasive cartography. They want to persuade you. It's part of the PR, what we call it today. So the iconography, what is about the iconography? What is a typical? This is, again, one map of the Mexico. It's map of Pimeria Alta, compiled by the most famous Jesuit cartographer, Francesco Eusebio Kino, in late 17th century. So what is typical for the Jesuit cartography? You can see the basic presentation of the physical geography. You can see with the red letters the names of the indigenous community they made. They are always there. You can see all the missions presented by the symbol of the cross or symbol of the churches. again, very typical, but you can also see these settlements which are indigenous villages. So they didn't forget to include indigenous geography or indigenous landscape in their map. And that is something very typical for missionary cartography. And last but not least, there is an image in the center of the map, of course, presentation of the martyrdom, which is very often motif on their map. This is illustration of the martyrdom of Francesco Xavier Saeta, who been killed in Pimeria Alta. So the image highlights their sacrifice for the colonial power, but also for the religious enlightenment. So that is the typical iconography of Jesuit map makings. But it's also very important to note that the manuscript Jesuit maps are less focused on iconography and strong images than the printed version. This is a map that you already saw. This is the manuscript original. That is the printed version of the same map. So you can see clearly a difference. This is a very simple map with very discrete symbol of the Society of Jesus, and that's it. There is no lots of story about the Jesuits as a central part of the map. However, here, look at all these illustrations that are result of editorial intervention into the original Jesuit maps. So you can see the presentation of flora and fauna because they wanted to highlight the richness of the region. You can see the local people presented, and of course you can see the images of the martyrdoms. So these strong images are, as a rule, result of the editorial intervention into map, not a result of the original Jesuit map compiled on the field. Which is also interesting that Jesuits start to map a certain region in the interior before the first missions were established. And that is very important because they mapped indigenous landscape as it was in pre-colonial time. So this is one of the manuscript maps that shows a Mojos region. It's modern-day Bolivia. The map was compiled in 1667, and you can see the rivers, the indigenous settlements, so it's all pre-colonial. All the place names you can see are indigenous place names. And all that textuality that you can see on the map, that is the certain sign that text is a result of indigenous knowledge, because in indigenous culture, geography, their sense of space was not mathematical as European one. They expressed their knowledge with words, not with lines necessary. So all this text you can find here, it's actually indigenous knowledge. So early Jesuit maps actually mapped, they notified complete pre-colonial indigenous landscapes that will soon disappear, unfortunately. This is the map of the same region, the Mojos province, about 50 years later. It's 1713. So what happened with a Jesuit image of the same place? So you can see they kept the name, the ethnonyms, the name of the indigenous community, but the place names are start to be replaced. So renaming of the place names is in the full swing. The original indigenous place names start to disappear, and they've been erased and replaced by European place names, mostly Christian names. So the place names became a visual dimension of territorial and intellectual conquest of the space. So that's what happened in the 18th century. And for the end of my presentation, something about their vision of others in their map. The most important others, of course, are indigenous community they made, although they are not the only others on the map. Even others, as a rule, were presented as a part of colonial drive. So this is a very famous map of Amazonia by Samuel Fritz in 1707. You can see the Spanish part of Amazonia. This is the Portuguese part. There is no border, but if you take a closer look, I don't think you can see it. There is a symbol of Society of Jesus in the form of the sun, but the sun shines only on the Spanish side. There is no sun on the Portuguese side. So that was the hidden presentation of the future borderland. But what is important about the iconography of this map and presentation of the others is the illustrations. Look at this illustration. Here is one of the Native American holding a moon and the sun in his hand, referring to Amerindian paganism, of course. But look at this image above him. He was enlightened by the faith. So he was changed from the paganism. Another Native American holds a coat of arms of the Spanish Empire in his bare hand, sustaining the Spanish Empire, literally, and symbolically. So this is, again, a very strong image. And there is another illustration down there. It's a double illustration. First, it's actually illustration of the 2 stages of missionization. Here you can see a very modest indigenous people. They are very modest, they hunting, they struggle, but they're wild indigenous people. But on the right, you can see indigenous American with wearing a cross on the neck, and he harvesting a large fruits and large animals. So that was the message, how good to be to receive the proper faith. Of course, some presentation of indigenous communities are very documentary and some are very westernized. So again, manuscript maps are much better source for that. This is the illustration from the map of Sonora that we saw at the beginning of my presentation. And this presentation of the Seri people is very documentary, and which is very interesting. The Seri people are actually presented as a family. You can see child, woman, a man. So they are not presented as a warriors, as a hunters, but people who value family life. So very friendly image of others. In the other hand, in this printed map of America by Thomas Faulkner, we can see 2 Native Americans, a woman, a wife and a man who actually helped compilation of that map. They provided the map maker with geographical knowledge, but their appearance is completely westernized. So if you want to find documentary presentation, how Jesuits actually saw indigenous community, you can search for the manuscript maps, not the printed versions. Of course, others were used to promoting missionization. This is one very strong and very important map. It's a French Jesuit map of the New France that was produced by Francesco Giuseppe Bressani in 1657. And it is the first map to thematize the martyrdom. This map was actually inspired by personal experience because Giuseppe Bressani was captured by Mohawk community, and they've been kept captured for a few months, and he been tortured, and he witnessed the martyrdom of his colleague Jean de Brebeau and Gabriel Alemant. So he was in shock, actually, what happened. So he compiled this map of the New France with 2 confronting illustrations. One is presentation of the martyrdom, which is very powerful, but he also added a counterpoint. So we can see a Native American family praying under cross. So he wanted to send a message, there is a hope. Yes, some bad things happened in the field, but there is also a hope, a religious enlightenment. In general, the relation to others in Jesuit maps is very ambivalent, and it was again dependent on the local historical context. Sometimes the indigenous communities are presented as friends, sometimes as enemies. This is the illustration from one map of Chile by Alonso de Ovalle from 1646. So there is a scene from Arauco War when the Spanish troops are in conflict with indigenous warriors. So that map appeared in the war times. In the other hand, of course, we have also illustration about the martyrdoms, but there are also illustration about the indigenous people, which show them as friends of the Jesuits and supporters of the Society of Jesus. So in this particular illustration, the Native American hold a measuring tools, suggesting they contributed to appearance of that map. So you can see their relationship with indigenous community was very ambivalent, based on the local historical context. It was a peace or it was a war, depending. But in general, there is a strong indigenous presence in all Jesuit maps. So they really value their culture and their societies. So what is to conclude? The French, Spanish, and the Portuguese Jesuit cartographies of America have evolved in very different imperial historical contexts. And as a result, there is a huge diversity of Jesuit maps by context and purpose, but they are always coherent by specific iconography. There is a strong impact of the Jesuits in early modern era to secular affairs. So their maps are mostly referred to secular affairs. The Spain produced a largest number of maps. They had a strong impact, but they've been more focused on missions. In contrast, Brazil, the Jesuit cartography in Brazil actually supplemented a lack of state and military mapping. So Jesuits in Brazil were involved in all state and military affairs because there was no other cartographers. And in the New France is the third situation, because the New France had very early official cartographers and hydrographers in New France. So Jesuits did not produce so many maps, and most of the Jesuit maps in New France were focused on trade and explorations. Jesuit cartography in all three empires were crucial link between initial exploration and colonial cartography that developed in mid-18th century. And last but not least, Jesuits were instrumental to the Western image of the New World. So they actually transferred the knowledge they gained based on their own experience. They took from the indigenous community and they all transferred to the West and influenced the European image of the New World. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you for that introduction. And before we start, I'd like to thank Dr. Erik de Boom for inviting me, and Gilke Gantz and the other people of the staff for their support in organizing this event. Of course, special thanks to the University Center St. Ignatius Antwerp and the University of Antwerp, of course, for hosting us. I'm very happy to be here with Dr. Mirela Altic and Dr. Christiane Stallaert. Given the event focus on Jesuit missions during the Baroque era, I will concentrate more specifically on religious conversion. This is the central theme of my book, Missionizing on the Edge, which came out at the end of 2022 from Brill. And in this presentation, I will explore two essential facets concerning how indigenous communities embrace and adapt Catholic devotions and beliefs. First, I will explore the sacraments and how natives infused them with meanings that diverged from the priest's intentions. Second, I focus on how priests distinguished between civil costumes, like music, dances, games, etc., that were tolerated, and on the other side, religious rites that were to be opposed, resulting in ambiguities, as innocent native customs often expressed their religious worldview. Our case study centers on the missions of Minas, a missional jurisdiction similar to those in Paraguay. This region was situated in western Amazonia, primarily spanning from the frontier areas of present-day Ecuador, Peru, and Brazil. The Jesuits established a presence there from 1638, and their mission lasted until 1768. The Jesuits encountered significant challenges in establishing the mission system in Minas. These hurdles included the remarkable linguistic and ethnic diversity of the indigenous populations and the difficulty of raising cattle necessary for settling natives in the challenging Amazonian terrain. Despite these obstacles, Minas experienced a moderate trend of demographic growth. The native population increased from more than 7,000 individuals in 28 missions in 1719 to more than 11,000 natives in 21 pueblos by 1768. In these circumstances, did Amazonian indigenous groups truly converted to Christianity? Before we delve into that question, let's first explore the concept of conversion. Traditional views inherited from missionaries the expectation of a one-sided process. However, the adoption of Christian elements was a complex, collaborative process involving specific transmission situations in which both sides actively engage in cultural exchange. Traditional approaches often framed conversion as a purely intellectual transformation, overlooking the significance of ritual practices in internalizing religious ideas as fostering a sense of identity. Post-Tridentine missionary continually raised the bar for doctrinal understanding, reducing the levels of tolerance. However, there was substantial ambiguity since practices such as the use of holy water, the sign of the cross, holy candles, church bells, consecrated herbs, and Latin incantations for healing or exorcism were accepted by the church and could be perceived as magical by the natives. Finally, colonial conversions did not primarily involve natives completely forsaking the cosmic worldviews. Instead, according to ethnohistorians and anthropologists, these conversions often entailed the reinterpretation of ancient traditions through the lens of Christian concepts. The Jesuit documentation I studied for my book reveals that many indigenous people endeavored to integrate elements of Christian religion, sometimes with an excess of interest and an autonomy that made missionaries uncomfortable. However, the Jesuits were the first to recognize that their evangelization efforts in Minas had very poor results comparing to Paraguay, for example. Despite this, Jesuits recorded the existence of a small but important number of those they called good Christians and provided valuable information on how native people adopted elements of Christian religion. Could they also be considered Christians? Although Jesuits had doubts about it. The Jesuits were by no means more tolerant in Amazonia than in other missions in the Americas, as numerous conflicts attest. The obstacle they found in Amazonia, particularly difficult sedentarization and linguistic diversity, however, forced Jesuits to adopt a pragmatic attitude and bet on a long-term Christianization. In this scenario, natives were able to appropriate elements of Christianity according to their traditional criteria of classification and appreciation. This presentation examines these hybrid and negotiated appropriations. Missionaries, it seems, could not advance certain practices and representations that ensure their acceptance and the intelligibility of their message. So I'll deal first with the sacraments. Baroque priests held the sacraments in the highest regard, and Father José de Acosta, the Spanish responsible for the implementing of Tridentine norms in the late 16th century in Peru, underscored this emphasis in his writings. But there were important tensions between the sacraments and many indigenous practices and beliefs. Baptism and extreme unction clashed with indigenous healing practices and preparations for death. For example, as Father Juan Manin noted, they say of baptism, I quote, "Why does the priest think it is bad to heal the sick with breath when he himself breathes on the baptized? Confession runs counter to the pre-Hispanic notions of sin and hell. Marriage clashes with polygyny, the basis of chief's power, and communion and ritual anthropophagy. If they were communed, lamented Father Manin, I quote, they say among themselves that they had a good breakfast." The administration of the sacrament of baptism, it seems, did not escape selectivity criteria. In keeping with Tridentine guidelines, Jesuits considered it wrong to baptize adults without first catechizing them and instructing them in the mysteries of the Catholic faith, and no less of an error to leave them without a missionary. Aside from catechists, baptism was only suitable for newborns and the sick in periculus mortis. Native people tended to ascribe magical properties to baptism, viewing as a kind of spell that could bring bodily health or death. And in this sense, they received the missionary as someone who fulfilled a role similar to shamans. The Cunivos, painting their bodies and played festive music as Father Henrique Richter baptized their infants. The Iameus endowed baptisms with capacities to prevent or heal illness. In their language, baptism was known as muzuna, the same term that, although it means medicine, was used for a poisonous herb. And when an individual who had been baptized fell ill, they brought them to the priest to be baptized once again. In some cases, as among the Yurimaguas, baptism could be analogized to traditional indigenous rituals of preparation for an adequate crossing between the world of the living and of the dead. According to Pablo Maroni, the missionary, an elderly woman who fell ill asked to be baptized, although her relatives made fun of her. After she died, she appeared to her son and told him, I quote, "My son, my soul, more brilliant than the sun, was taken to an extremely pleasant country, where I see admirable things that I am unable to explain. And all this is due to the baptism that I received at the hands of the priest, without which I would have irrevocably gone to hell." Although Maroni portrays the native who gave this testimony as not yet Christian, His account is quite similar to those of European Christians who, according to Jean de Lumeau, also believed in apparitions, who returned to exhort their relatives to correctly follow Christian life. The Council of Trent renewed the importance of confession, a fundamental tool for controlling consciences. The Jesuits esteemed this sacrament in particular for transforming customs. Lent was especially reserved for this sacrament. During the rest of the year, those who had not confessed during Lent, those who had spontaneously want to do so, and those who were getting married went to the confession. This sacrament imposes a series of categories of on natives with which they were to evaluate their own actions and thoughts. That is to say, it inculcates feelings of guilt that weighed on the transgressor's conscience and the imperative of penitence. Natives were obliged to list their sins and arrange them in a hierarchical order according to a very specific system of reference that they learned from the missionaries. For instance, a testimony corroborating the success of the introduction of confessions elaborates on the traditional narratives of a battle between the forces of good and evil and stresses how the sacrament even served to expel the devil from certain souls he had taken captive. Writing about one of the oldest missions in Minas, Father Juan Batista Julian referred to the following episode, I quote, "This soul was deceived by the devil and was in close familiarity with his infernal enemy, and for that very reason he made it a living hell of abominations. The advice of the confessor was so beneficial to this unfortunate that by the grace of God, in a short time this person was entirely free of such an infamous captivity, and in more than a year had not fallen into torpid sin of any kind." Confession served as a mechanism for missionaries to assert their power over a community. Hence, why the first question always concerned whether the native person had already confessed and whether they had fulfilled their penitence. The Confessionário de Tonamas, compiled by the French traveler Alcide d'Aubigny in 1830, included questions such as, I quote, "Have you obeyed your priests? Have you spoken ill of them? Have you wanted to kill them?" After hearing the answers, the priest should sentence it as follows: "Look, son, do not talk about the priests, not about your neighbor, because the devil will take your tongue out in hell. And remember what God says: see, hear, smell, and shut up." Post-Tridentine clergy were particularly concerned with controlling native sexual practices. If questions regarding theft, contact with the devil, and ritual drinking, or borracheras, were common, those concerning sexuality predominated in the questionnaires, revealing the validity, even in remote regions, of what Regina Harris called the theology of concupiscence. Of the 18 questions contained in the small confessional for the ticunas that Father Manuel de Uriarte transcribed in the mid-18th century, 7 touched on the theme of sexuality. Fornication was an especially recurring topic. The priest must ask native men and women if they had sinned with married or single people, with relatives, or if they had only desired to do so. They must also inquire whether they, I quote, "played dishonestly with man, woman, or alone, if they polluted themselves, and if they thought about man or woman." Priests were also to ask women if they had taken abortive herbs, or killed newborns. This text reveals Jesuits' efforts to impose strident and Catholic sexual and familial models, even in remote regions. Confession gave access to a network of information that was essential for regular sexuality. In border regions, however, there were spaces for negotiation, hybridization, and misunderstandings. The great diversity of languages, which required the mediation of interpreters, made confessions more challenging, as did natives' difficult assimilation the concepts of regret. Visitor Carlos Brentano lamented that some indigenous people did not assimilate sacrament's meaning, and I quote, taking it purely as a matter of formality because of the habit of silencing their sins. On the same subject, Father Francisco Zefiris wrote, I quote, if the priest asks them, for example, whether they are sorry for something, they respond laughing, and it was very good for them, and they still feel happy for having followed their will. When asked whether he wanted to confess, an indigenous man who had called Father Dertré to visit him in his deathbed responded, I quote, Dear Father, you would do me a much great favor by passing a good cup of aguardiente right now. Aguardiente is a liquor made of sugar cane. Commenting on misunderstanding involving the sacrament of confession among Amazonians, Padre Pedro de Mercado underlined that many natives sought to confess with their shamans. Others remembered the sins of deceased relatives, and some delegated the obligation to the spouse or children. While acknowledging the rapid acceptances of confession, the priests tended to describe the way in it was practiced in missions with disapproval, emphasizing their perception that natives treated the sacrament with excessive familiarity and in some cases with irreverence. Despite such challenges, confession's disciplinary effects must not be minimized. One missionary claiming to have achieved important shifts, and I quote him, I can say that in this reduction of Ángeles de Roamainas, when I entered, everything was idolatry, everything was formal idolatry to the same devil. Spells, deaths, public amancipamientos, the relation between unmarried couples. And since I have spoke and confessed them in their own language, they have totally abandoned these vices. They confess and commune every 8 days, some more frequently, which more benefit to their souls that in many cases it is ordinarily necessary to resort to their past life to find material for absolution. Jesuits recognizes the difficulty of eliminating polygyny and introduction the sacrament of matrimony. Here, as in other places, priests encountered what they referred to as a already established false version of the sacrament. Native men married 2 or 3 women, and if they were a chief or a curaca, 6 or 7. The man supported his wife's mothers, all living together with separate possessions and child rearing. In many Amazonian societies, couples would choose to part ways at their discretion and seek new companions. While polygyny was reserved for caciques and distinguished warriors, common natives contented themselves with just one wife. In most societies, it was common for the groom to raise his bride-to-be from a young age. Jesuit recognizes that these relationships were the most stable, given the constancy of love that a child tends to engender. And apparently they did not put any impediments in the continuation of this practice. Jesuit accounts agreed that a good number of Amazonians were unwilling to abandon polygyny. For these groups, the issue was non-negotiable. and they demonstrated it in uprisings. For instance, in 1667, Pedro Soares, a missionary among the Avejira of the Curaray River Valley, was killed while insisting on abolishing polygyny. A priest wrote that Soares, I quote, preached with great favor and spirit against this barbaric custom, telling natives that it was by this path that their ancestors went to hell. Claiming that their ancestor went to hell offended the natives, who wondered how this could be the case without any knowledge of Christianity. Soares' death forced the Jesuits to take care not to advance too rapidly. In her study on the sacraments in colonial Latin America, Monica Patricia Martini found the Jesuits were also forced to tolerate polygyny for quite some time among the Guarani, because, among other reasons, there was no consensus to which of their unions was the legitimate one. Moreover, polygyny conferred prestige to the caciques, and Jesuits depended on their authority to govern the missions. As the position chiefs held required them to distribute chicha, a liquor made from corn, manioc, and other fruits, and served at feasts, and as it was made by women, a single wife would not be enough for this job. In Father José Gomilha's opinion, polygyny stemmed less from sexual interest in the various wives than from their work in the fields and the prestige that they conferred to the powerful men who could support them. It was up to the chief to divide the corresponding plots of land among his wives, so that each could work a parcel. Father Gomilha strongly advised missionaries not to innovate on anything related to polygyny until natives were prepared to abandon this practice. The priests who touched on the theme before the appropriate time risked lose everything in a single day. And I quote Gomilha again. In order to banish the darkness, the sun slowly sends its first rays at dawn, gradually increasing then until in the light of the clear day, the shadows are banished at last. We'll talk a little bit about the relation between civil customs and religious rites. Religions frequently saw similarities and analogies between pre-Hispanic beliefs and Christianity. In the first decades of the evangelization, the friars understood them as a millenary sign of the apostle St. Thomas preaching, and that the ground was already prepared for universal Christianization. But the orthodoxy that emerged from the Council of Trent did not make concessions on this kind. To Father Acosta, for example, they were nothing more than imitations of the devil instilled. The devil was called the God's ape for these imitations, and he was the direct beneficiary of the construction of temples, confession, purification, and Eucharistic rituals, and even of the 3 statues in the Cusco, which appear to imitate the Holy Trinity. The first Jesuits who worked in the Minas found that some groups practiced a type of confession that they did not hesitate to describe as directly inspired by the devil. And I quote, "Impressively, the devil introduced a mode of confession among these barbarians that they do with their priests, the shamans. This is in the annual letter of 1652. And the devil himself is so indignant at the falsehood of the penitents that when they omit some fault, the barbaric confessor shows him that the false penitents lies. And if that were not enough, the devil makes a frog or toad enter and walk around the miserable penitents' necks and chest. And this makes them reveal what they have been hiding. As Father Acosta emphasizes, one of the missionary's most important tasks was to distinguish between civil customs, which priests believed to have no specific religious content, such as music, dances, etc., and religious rites, properly speaking, which often imitated Christian ones and were demonic in their inspiration. Civil customs could be tolerated and, depending on the circumstances, were even encouraged. Moreover, in Iberic tradition, civil customs were associated with self-government, which was the counterpart that ensured a specific community loyalty and obedience to the monarchy. On the other hand, religious rites should not be tolerated because they were understood as evidence of a pagan religion. They were the product of error, in the opinion of Jesuits, which the devil took advantage of to instill beliefs in idols, witchcraft, anthropophagy, polygyny, and other abuses. But the path to salvation was open to indigenous people if they accepted the Christian doctrine and way of life and abandoned the old idolatry. In Minas, as in other regions, missionaries' effort to distinguish between innocent civil customs and pernicious religious rites were ongoing and permanent, with misunderstandings. The Jesuit program was not holistic. If it is true the Jesuits sought to transform natives' cultural and political patterns and eliminate the practice and beliefs that run counter the Christianity, they did not seek to completely reconstruct indigenous ways of life. Missionaries even encouraged certain native practices in the areas of medicine, agriculture, hunting, collecting, dancing, and the perform of certain celebrations. It did not occur to the Jesuits to mistrust the religious content of these practices. Writing from the Pueblo of Pebas in 1738, Father Wiedemann related that whenever possible, he participated in native feasts. Natives went to his house, gave him food and drink, and offering a performance in which woman and man danced, accompanied by flutes and other instruments. Wiedemann considered the performance in good taste and worthy of being reproduced in the mission theater. Jesuits recognized that they could not completely eliminate ritual drinking. It was also called borracheras, given that they were the basis that supported the system of social distinction that guaranteed chiefs' power and consequently the obedience of the old orders that followed from them, given by the missionaries themselves. Father Mercado mentions that before the start of the missions, Amazonians tended to hold their borracheras, the ritual drinking, in a celebration house, in which there was a distinction in the seats. The best seats in that house, generally hammocks, were reserved for caciques, while warriors and members of the chief's entourage sat on benches and wooden boards covered with blankets. The rest of the attendees sat on the ground or in the pieces of wood. Jesuits could not deny that these parties reinforced social hierarchies. But if missionaries could not abolish borracheras, they tried at least to limit them. Father Mercado wrote, "Because it was not possible to take everything from them, they have allowed them what was lawful, seeking to hinder what is unlawful." However, it was extremely difficult for missionaries to know the exact meaning that natives attribute to certain customs. For example, Father Manin lamented that among the Omaguas, who were also already Christians, until today, I quote, it was not being possible to extirpate one of the most pernicious customs, which consists of drawing magical signs on their foreheads with 2 lit sticks. The Omaguas believed that shaping children's heads into a pointed form made them resemble the moon, a tradition that ensured even after the Jesuits were expelled. The Missiamais Father Uriarte contacted had the habit of piercing the ears from the bottom, so much that they put it boards in patents and walked is misshapen. Other groups maintaining the traditional body paintings, even participating in Christian celebration with them, alleging that they protected the skin from drying and mosquito bites. The Jesuits' attempts to transform certain customs achieved dubious results. The Omaguas consumed a type of tobacco called curupa, or paricá, which in powder form was snorted through 2 long straws, like in this image. Through this means, they got drunk in order to perform divinations. Uriarte found that courage to address this practice when a lightning bolt struck the curupa tree. And shortly thereafter, the community experienced the tragic loss of some children. Uriarte likely contended that these events were clear signs of divine disapproval regarding the curupa, leading to a growing inclination among some natives to abandon this practice. Despite Father Uriarte's misgivings, Omagua self-identified as Christians and even used the Tupi term to refer to those who were not, tapuya. Prior to European arrival, this term was used to designate non-Tupi people, but in Portuguese America, it acquired the connotation of a barbaric group that rejected Christianity. It appears that this was the sense the Omaguas used, as recorded by Jesuit Uriarte. They were proud to be Christians, and that they themselves asked for the priests. One of them, named Agustin, was dying, and I was about to give him the holy unction. He was crying, fearing that with it he would die very quickly. His wife, named Micaela, began to preach to him, saying that he was not tapuya, so they called the heathens, and that he should receive the holy oil and trust in the priest. And with that, he agreed to receive it. The documentation is not always clear on whether Jesuits tolerated these costumes because they characterized them as civil and ignored their religious content, or because they knew of their religious aura but could not repress them without deleterious effects to the missions. In a critical paper written in 1752, Jesuit Leonardo Dobler challenged his colleagues in Minas for not being more strict about native marriages, celebrations, and borracheras. The missionaries' rebuttal was brisk. Dobler should seek something more edifying to do than question the missionaries' superior orders. The missionaries defended themselves by insisting that would be untenable to keep indigenous people in the missions without such concessions, provided such practices were carefully limited. In sum, the distinction between customs and rite produced tensions, as even innocent indigenous customs expressed a great deal of their religious view of the world. Native people confirmed the ambiguity of a missionary project that, although it could censor some rites it classified as idolatry, tolerated feasts and dances that were equally permeable to old beliefs, but which priests did not understand as such. There were also issues regarding indigenous forms of appropriating Catholic festivals and devotions. Of course, the Baroque pomp was a powerful tool to for evangelization because it offered natives unequivocal signs that the Christian divinity could reveal himself to the senses in a manner surpassing that of their own gods. Although Amazonian chiefdoms had temples, Catholic churches would have certainly impressed natives for their size and ornamentation, for the images within them, particularly the crucifix with its painted face, a bloody body, and crown of thorns, juxtaposed with Mary's sweet maternal image, not to mention the music, the lighting, and the incense. The symbolic centrality of the temple, the frequency of processions, the emotion of the flagellants, the eloquence of the sermons, the persuasive influence of the images, theatrical performances, and musical pieces, all this, even in spite of the limitations that Amazonian condition imposed, appealed to the emotions, the taste for ritual, and the presence of the sacred in the daily life, attracting both natives and Jesuits alike. Nevertheless, the Jesuits remained largely unaware of the significance that their inclusion of indigenous element in the Baroque ritual held for the native populations. For instance, in Minas, as in other missions, indigenous musicians played clarinets, harps, violins, and violas. Others were skillful singers of sacred music. But some priests recorded the incorporation of certain native instruments in Catholic celebrations, such as the Tucano flutes that emitted sound similar to an organ. Moreover, Christian celebrations protocols were ambiguously related to those of native festivals. Writing in 1661 on the missions of Heberos, Figueroa noted that natives celebrated the feasts of the patron saint and Corpus Christi with processions, dances, flute, music, castle made of flowers, and this is more interesting, birds and other living animals, and arches made of palms. As Father Chantre Iehera recognized, decorating the path of the procession with live animals, monkeys, birds, and fish, in addition to fruit and other comestibles, as if they were hidden offerings, was not exactly what the Church prescribed, but the Jesuit hoped that with the time, these rituals were more closely approximate to the Iberian model. Father Fernandez described how, in advance of holy processions, native captured birds, jaguars, and other animals that they tied down and arranged along the route of the Blessed Sacrament to pay homage and tribute to the common Lord. If certain ethnographies on how these Amazonian societies perceive nature as lively and endowed with intentionality are to be believed, natives' concern with bringing live animals to the processions can be understood in light of the belief that, I quote the anthropologist Eduardo Viveiros de Castro, humans are those who remain the same with themselves, and animals are ex-humans, and not humans ex-animals. This presentation analyzed the presence of native elements re-elaborated in the Christianity that emerged in missions. That is, indications that indigenous people appropriated elements of Christianity, infusing them with meanings that diverged from those missionaries expected. These reframings are explained by missionaries' dependence on native mental schemes that ensure their acceptance in communities and allowing them to present Christian concepts and practices as close and familiar. The natives' ability to attribute distinct meaning to the sacraments and other Catholic practices arose from the missionaries' reliance on concepts present in native languages, enable translation and rendering Christian doctrine comprehensible. Missionaries' distinction between civil costumes devoid of idolatry and religious rites left room for ambiguity that natives knew how to exploit. Missionaries should combat what they saw as idolatrous rites, but they could tolerate those costumes that appeared innocent and even trivial, which, for their part, expressed a great deal of natives' religious vision. It matters little whether Jesuits characterized rituals as civil costumes when they were convinced that could not abolish them, or if they truly did not see any religious elements in certain celebrations, dances, personal adornments, and the like. Natives certainly noted the ambiguity and the even arbitrariness with which priests censored certain aspects of their cultures, believing them to be imbued with idolatry, while tolerating others equally permeated by native religiosity, but which could pass for or were mistaken for civil costumes. A sign that a not insignificant number of natives might have been converted was precisely the persecution they began to suffer when appropriating Christian elements autonomously. Thus, priests came to see them no longer as infidels, but as individuals whose practices and beliefs resembled those in the church fought against in Europe, the heretics. In some communities of the Iberian Peninsula, saints were considered patrons, but in ways that did not always coincide with Catholic orthodoxy. People from different social strata assumed the saints could cause harm if their vows were not respected. Not a few Iberians believed necromancers could invoke the dead, bone setters could cure diseases, and cloud conjurers could warn of storms. The lines between the idolatrous and the pious were not always clear, for it was often priests themselves who were the protagonists of these activities. By persecuting certain natives' interpretation of Catholicism, the religious authorities presupposes the natives have entered with the scopes of popular Christianity, a dangerous territory that demanded rather than dismissed missionary paternal tutelage. Finally, it is undeniable that interest in Christianity was uneven among Amazonian groups. The Jesuits exploited this difference by putting groups in contact so that the example of some could encourage the others. Jesuit sources are almost unanimous in identifying the Heberos as the group that took the greatest liking in the new religion. They built the best temple in the province and the pueblo of Limpia Concepcion. However, although the Jesuits consider many Heberos to be Christian, they do not consider them old enough or rooted enough in the faith as the descriptions I have included in this presentation of how Heberos blended pagan offerings into Christian celebrations indicate. Again, the Jesuits knew that this was something that could happen even among old Christians in Europe. They also knew that putting these shortcomings in their writings, allowing them to persuade both the tutelage over the natives and their possession over the vast rainforest. Amazonian natives experiencing Christianity more as a continuation of the familiar religious universe than as a rupture of it. Missionaries had to depart from practical and symbolic continuities, such as the preservation of certain customs and the translation of Christian doctrine into concepts available in native languages that facilitated the acceptance of Christianity, but at the cost of natives adopting it on their own terms. In this scenario, it seems likely that many of the indigenous people reduced in Minas incorporate a number of Christian elements into their daily practices, rituals, and worldview. They did so according to their interest and as circumstances allowed. Missionaries had to call their attention to the contradictions between religious novelties and the ancient tradition, which, it seems, did not hold the same relevance for natives. Thank you.
So thank you very much and congratulations. I read your book. It's full of very interesting information. I enjoyed it very much. We have not so much time left, so I have lots of questions, but I try to go to maybe the most passing from the past to the present. And so it's clear from both presentations, knowledge is power. You say it also in your books. How can, or how could, or maybe better, how can indigenous people today benefit from all this knowledge they so generously gave to the Jesuits, the maps, the ethnographic accounts? What can they do with it in nowadays when there exist indigenous rights? So can it be useful for them to make claims to the state?
I think it's work. I think they have done. The Jesuits have done a very useful work preserving the indigenous knowledge and sending it to the Western countries, because the knowledge is preserved and now it's coming back and it's used as a base of preservation, of restoration, of recovering of lots of customs they've been lost in last to maybe 100 years mostly. So I think that knowledge, that the notice about their knowledge make lots of use today in the contemporary society, because enables them to go back and to renew their customs and even a language. You have to know that Jesuits compiled most of the first dictionaries of indigenous languages that been sent to the Western world to be printed in most cases. So thanks to that, the indigenous communities today, especially in Canada and United States, they have a printed dictionaries of the language they forgot to speak sometimes. So I think their work is still very actual, very, very important for the contemporary indigenous societies.
Yeah, I think it's very important, and I'm glad you bring the topic of the translation and the dictionaries. There was a lot of languages, especially in Amazonia, that the indigenous people itself disappeared, but we have the language, the dictionary, and most of this material is in manuscript form. So much was not yet published, because this manuscript circulated between the missionaries, and this is a very, very interesting information that we have about this people that unfortunately disappeared. But regarding the experience of encounter and the religious communication and dialogue, it's very interesting because two things. First, it was not very clear in the official narrative of the Jesuits, the perspective that they impose a religion and natives absorb that religion and abandon completely their traditions, their customs, their rituals and everything. This appeared in the more official documentation in books that Jesuits circulated, much of them like a propaganda of the religious order. But in the concrete field, with the primary documentation, the manuscripts, we see a lot of complexity. We see that Jesuits, not sure if this something is a religious practice or not. but they tolerate this thing because otherwise they can be expelled from that region. And the other thing is that it shows us that we know that most of indigenous people in Latin America today accepted Christianity. The people that declared themselves as indigenous, there's a very important number in this population that declared themselves also as Christians, and they did not abandon the ancient traditions and even a lot of knowledge and of their ancestors. So this situation that we live today is the same that Jesuits experienced, and most more recently the theologians, Jesuit theologians, are incorporating this ecumenism in their reflections about how the conversion process works.
I would like to come back to my question, because I was thinking more about the hard use of all this knowledge. For instance, maps to show or to claim their territories, ancestral territories, and so on, or ethnographic knowledge to claim their recognition as an indigenous people. What about that? You give some examples in your book, I think, about Ecuador. And in Brazil, there are also Amazonian people who can make use of those maps. But how accessible is this knowledge for them, this documentation for them? You can go to the archives, but...
Well, there is a certain digitalization that makes things easier, of course. There is copies of the maps in these particular countries, because each map would send to the viceroys, to the provincial superiors, so there is more than one copy of each maps. But so yes, I would say yes, that can serve the purpose to claim the territory. But you also have to understand that indigenous communities have a very different sense of territory. It's not a territorial as we understand it today, because for them, the territory or the homeland is an idea which is not that connected strongly to the place, but with their souls and hearts and the culture and the customs they have. So we cannot say they would claim the territory in a classical sense. They would claim their rights based on those maps, but not a typical territory as we understand the territory today. So it's another sense for geography, completely different one.
Yes, but when they want to claim something nowadays in Brazil, for instance, they have to deal with a Western state, with a mentality also of what is a territory within a Western state. So this Western knowledge of the Jesuits from former times can be useful for them, because it relates to what's the mentality of the state they have to deal with. Something I like very much in your book, because when we speak about Jesuit missions, we normally used to think about Paraguay, where they were very successful. But you took the counter example, a failed mission, not successful. And I was thinking, because you analyze the failure of sustainability of this mission, and because there was a lack of goods to trade with, there was a lack of Jesuits, missionaries, there was a lack of workers, there was a lack of agricultural land. So I was wondering the ecological footprint of those missions in the Amazonian region. And then I put it together with the motto of the Jesuits: one world is not enough. Today we say there is no planet B. So how was the impact in ecological terms of ecological footprint of this Jesuit view of missions, in the sense of creating urban life, and this sense of reductions, congregating, displacing people. Maybe you can comment on this.
This is a vast topic. I will say that, first of all, the Jesuits, because of the experience of Paraguay, they have a very clear vision of what a mission should look like. It's a very huge urban settlement with urban houses, with a big church, with cattle, with sedentary people, with intensive agriculture, with exportation of goods and making money. This is the model in Paraguay. But there was nothing of that in Amazonia. The region was not suitable for cattle. Some spaces have a very limited condition to produce agricultural goods in large scale. And the indigenous people, they resisted to live together in large populations because of the environment. It's very difficult to maintain agricultural structure to provide food for 3,000 people. So the population needs to be small. So they made a lot of adaptations in this process. So this is because this experience is very rich, because they reframed the idea of mission, and I would say that was a failure, because it deviate from the original model. But the mission have a long. There was one of the most ancient missions in Latin America. It started in 1638, and the another thing related to ecological problems is because with time the Jesuits learned from the indigenous people the value of the Amazonian goods. So although they call this experience a failure, they made some economical profit in this region, and this is why the mission had this long duration. For example, cacao. This region is very production in cacao is very rich. Other balsams, and they call it in Brazil drogas do sertão. Is a lot of spices, fruits that are collected in the forest, and much of these things we are accustomed today. Everybody knows what açaí means, and a lot of products used in beauty products for so everything started there. So this is a very important contribution from the Jesuits.
Another thing, what Jesuits did, certainly with maps, is to fix knowledge, trying to fix a reality, writing down, fixing on paper a reality. But they were the very agents of change in the Americas. You gave the one of your examples, explained it a bit, but how sustainable was the knowledge they were trying to fix while they themselves were changing the whole environment, the human environment, societies, ecological, natural environment also. Making a map, I think it's a matter of years working on a map, but when they included the human geography of the region, it was so changing because of their proper mission in the region. How they dealt with that?
Well, they certainly make attention to all the changes in the environment, and in I would say in natural history, in physical geography, but also in the human geography of the space. What is typical for Jesuit approach to geographical knowledge in general, they start to make a survey of a certain moment and then notified all the changes that happen meanwhile, and they would work on the map for quite some time. So they would compile a map and then continue to work and supplement the map with additional changes, with additional information. Sometimes you have layers and layers of information that comes from different sides, and it notified different events that are not happen at the same time. So there is layers and layers on information. In that way, they actually created a narrative about the changing of the landscapes and, of course, about the power of colonization. Because I mentioned in the early maps, you can see pre-colonial world pretty much, and they noted all the elements of the space in the indigenous languages. They marked the indigenous place names. They marked the indigenous holy places on the map. But how the times go by, in the 18th century, most of those places gradually disappeared, and they've been replaced by colonial vision of the space and colonial infrastructure. So they noted all these places and transformation of the space from pre-colonial to colonial. So, but they tried to add as much layer as they could on one map.
Very interesting. Another interesting notion from your book is the notion of political silence in the maps. I think that if there is one emblematic blind spot on the map in colonial history, it was the heart of Africa, would be the Belgian Congo. But also you mentioned it in the Jesuit maps, the selection they made between leaving a map as a vacant territory to be filled by their work. Could you explain a bit?
Yeah, it's not refer only to Jesuit maps, but particularly to their maps. It's equally important what is on the map and what is not on the map. The both information are kind of messages. So the map is medium which makes a strong statement how you want to present a certain space or certain development of certain event. So the things you will put forward in the map, that is the message. And things that are missing is also a message that is missing. So sometimes when they want to put into focus indigenous landscape, they would put everything indigenous in the maps, but when it suits them, they would keep silence about them. And they would put only colonial things on the map, depend on what they actually advocate in that very moment. So map is a political statement. It was 200 years ago, and it is still today. There is a number of books in United States. You can buy it in the bookstores. How to win a presidential election by the maps. So the map is very powerful tool. It all depends how you use. And Jesuits knew that. So they've been very capable communicator. That's why I say those maps are part of so-called persuasive cartography, because they want to persuade a reader to a certain reality. And they know how to do that very well. They've been very skillful communicators.
you mentioned in your lecture, you mentioned the Brazilian anthropologist Viveiros de Castro. How important is for your work, because you work a lot with conversion, the notion of translation also. How important is it for you to take concepts or to know, to read contemporary anthropology?
Oh, it's extremely important. And in my presentation, I made this claim that particular episode reported by the Jesuits, they described how the indigenous people, we were commenting on this before the lecture, they during the procession in the church, they put a lot of living animals to receive the blessing of the during the celebration. So not just living animals, but agricultural goods and all things that. So this particular Jesuit, they made the claim that this is not what the Catholic Church teaches. This is some pagan, heathen practice that indigenous brought to the celebration. But this is something polemic, because we are discussing before the lecture. In other places in Europe, this costume existed with living animals in the celebration and the Catholic celebrations. But in the case of the indigenous people, and Eduardo Viveiros de Castro was one of the main intellectuals that developed this idea, is the theory of the animism, that for most of indigenous people in the Americas and some traditional peoples in other parts of the world, they believed that the animals are humans. In other terms, for a lack of better explanation, the animals are humans. So they have a conscience, they have in the past they have interaction with humans, and in most of the cases they had the human form, and the myths are precisely the moment where they lost the human form and became animals. So this is interesting. This is the idea that I brought in my presentations, because if they put the animals in the Catholic celebrations, they are also with the humans in that form. And this is very interesting, because I am a historian, and the contribution of anthropology is essential in trying to understand the perspective of the indigenous people, how we can see the historical process from their point of view. So the anthropology is essential.
Yeah,
essential.
But maybe just thanking you for your lectures, for presence, and for this nice conversation. Thank you. Thank you.